We want to welcome each of you into episode 4 of the Abundant Life podcast. For those of you that may not know, my name is Brian Egerton, and I'm joined once again by John Ferguson, and we're both ministers at the North Lexington Church of Christ in Lexington, Kentucky. We started this podcast because both of us have some background, some training in counseling, and we recognize there are many things that people struggle with in this world from a mental and emotional and a physical standpoint. And some of these things, if they're left unchecked, they can really wreak havoc on lives. And so we wanted to talk about some of these struggles and notice their effect from both a psychological standpoint and also look at them from a spiritual standpoint. For the next 2 weeks, we're actually going to be dealing with a topic that is maybe familiar to all of us, and all of us have experienced in one way or another, and that topic is grief. This week, in part 1 of this series, we're going to spend some time talking about what grief is, and talk about what are some of the symptoms of it, and how can it affect our lives, and we want to walk through the different stages of grief that we work through the grief process. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit about what we can do to help comfort those who may be grieving. So we hope you'll join us for this 2-part series here. But as we start a discussion here on grief, we want to consider the life of Job. Job in the Bible was a man who experienced grief in a real serious way. So John, as we think about grief in the life of Job, why don't you give us a little bit of background of Job and some of the sources of Job's grief?
Job was a very wealthy man in the land of Uz. I mean, he had cattle and had a great deal of wealth, but he was a very upright man, very religious. He's an individual that avoided all types of, we might say, evil, and he's tried to really followed God, and he avoided all the dark things of life, as we can see. However, Job went through a series of losses in his life. He lost his livelihood, he lost his children, he lost his health, he lost his wife's support, and we can see through further discussion on through, he even had some difficulty with his relationships with his friends. So the whole book of Job deals with the effects of human loss and how we can really relate that with God and find our way through it, work our way through that pain and that grief.
As we consider Job and the grief he experienced, let's first back up for just a minute and consider a little bit about what grief is. We recognize that Job faced grief in a serious way, but let's understand grief a little bit before we dissect the grief that he experienced in his life. First off, when we think about grief, we recognize that grief is defined as the emotional suffering that you feel when something or someone you love is taken away.
Yes.
This is an emotion. It's something that all of us have experienced, no matter how old we are in life.
Yes.
We've experienced loss in one way or another.
Yes.
Some of us maybe experienced grief in greater ways than others. But all of us, in one way or another, have experienced this feeling of something or someone being taken away from us, and oftentimes grief can lead to some pretty devastating symptoms in our life. It can cause some really serious hindrances in our life. Maybe we think about someone who's going through grief. Maybe they're experiencing shock or disbelief. Maybe they're experiencing these extreme episodes of sadness, or maybe they're weeping and crying because of the situation.
Yes.
Sometimes grief can even lead to guilt. We're grieving over someone, and maybe we feel guilty because of something we said, or maybe we think we led to this happening, or whatever. Maybe we feel grief.
Right.
Sometimes it can even lead to physical symptoms.
Oh, yes.
Maybe fatigue or or even insomnia. People struggling
Gotcha.
sleeping
Gotcha.
because of the grief they're dealing with. There are a lot of symptoms that can really be devastating and alter our normal lives
Gotcha.
as we're working through grief. But grief, oftentimes when we think about grief, we associate it with maybe death. Someone dies, and so we're grieving the loss of someone.
Yeah.
Can we experience grief in other areas of life other than the death of someone?
Yes, anytime there is a loss, no matter what it is, we probably experience grief so much. Even while we were little children, we experienced grief. We might not have viewed it as much, or we parents perhaps haven't taken it as seriously. Just the loss of a pet. Just say if an individual goes through a divorce, they have issues like that. That in of itself is a death. You grieve the loss of what could have been or what was and things of that nature. We do it through divorce. It may get different. We may lose our jobs. We may lose our health. All of those kinds of things really cause us to come into an emotional point because something is lost. We may not always get that back. There's a loss of hope of that. So grief comes in many ways because of many situations. So it's not just somebody passing or we're losing a loved one. It's just the ideal that we just lost our job. We could do things like that. That is grief. That is a grieving moment right there itself. It's a life-changing loss, and so we grieve it. Yes.
A lot of times we grieve because we lose something we had an attachment to.
Yes.
Maybe it is a spouse or a loved one, or maybe it's a close family member, or maybe a friend we've grown an attachment to, and when we don't have that anymore, we grieve because we've lost that thing that we were attached to.
Yes.
But you're right, that can be physical things too.
Right.
It can be a job, or it can be maybe a home we grew up in all our lives, and now we have moved from that home, and so anytime we lose something that we have this attachment to, we experience grief in one form or another. Obviously, certain things are going to cause a deeper grief than others, but we experience grief when we lose anything we're attached to.
That's right.
But what's interesting about grief is that it doesn't look the same in all people.
No.
John, you and I could experience the exact same thing.
Yes.
But we may approach our grief in very different ways.
Yes.
And there are some areas of grief that maybe you would spend more time working through, and I may breeze through those things, but there be maybe other areas that I struggle with more than you would.
Right.
So grief from one person to another is not going to be the same. So what's difficult about the concept of grief is you can't say this is what proper grief looks like or healthy grief looks like, because it is going to be different.
Going to be different
for everyone.
It's going to be different for everyone, and since it's different for everyone, the time span of it, that period of recovery from it, all of those things differ because, as you say, we have different emotional investment in certain things, and we find our sense of value in certain things and our connection. So every last one of us will experience grief differently because altogether our relationship and, as you said, our emotional and social attachment, those things are different. So we will respond differently.
See, although maybe grief is going to be different from one person to another, it's suggested by a psychiatrist who had done a lot of study in grief and loss, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She spent a lot of time studying and trying to dissect and understand a little bit about grief. And what Kubler-Ross said was that there are 5 stages that every person goes through when it comes to grief. There's not a particular order that people have to go through these. People may go through them in different stages, different orders, and there's no set length of time that people go through these different stages.
True.
But she suggested that everyone that's experiencing grief deals with each of these stages in one form or another.
Yes. So
as we think about grief and we understand what grief looks like, I want us to consider these 5 different stages of grief. And to do so, we want to look further into the life of Job.
Yes.
And recognize what he did as he was going through and experiencing these different stages of grief. And what we'll notice is maybe the way he approached these stages are different than what maybe you or I or someone else may do when they're experiencing them. But in one way or another, we all experience these different stages.
Right.
So as we think about these stages of grief, the first one that's suggested by Kubler-Ross is this stage of denial. And it's thought that when someone is experiencing the stage of denial, that maybe they think to themselves, "This can't be happening.
It can't be happening."
This loss has taken place, and they're struggling processing it, and they think to themselves that this really can't be true. This can't be happening. This isn't real. The denial stage is characterized by individuals who refuse to accept the fact of the loss and that it's occurred, and maybe they minimize and maybe even outright deny the situation at hand. So they can't accept that what's happened has really happened.
Yeah.
Job went through this, and again, maybe it's different than what others may look like in this denial stage, but I want us to think about the denial that Job faced here.
Okay.
In chapters 1 and 2. We see Job facing a lot of this loss. Really, in chapter 1, starting in verse 13, we see where there's a series of events that took place where he started facing these losses. And we're told that he was, one of his servants a messenger came running to him in verse 14 and said, the Sabians had come and they've taken all the oxen and killed all the servants, and he said, I'm the only one that's escaped. And as that messenger is talking, another one came up and said, lightning came from heaven, verse 16, and burned up all the sheep. And he said, I alone escaped. And while that person was still talking, verse 17, we see another servant comes in and says, the Chaldeans came and they raided the camels and they killed all the servants, and just I escaped. And verse 18, while he was still speaking, another one came and said, all of your children who had gathered in the home of your oldest son, they were killed from this great wind. And so here all at once, Job is experiencing this significant loss, and you can see him trying to process all of this that's taking place, but we see it's impossible. With all of those things happening, he could not process it at that moment. And so here he makes this statement, which kind of indicates his denial in Job chapter 1 and verse 21, where he said, naked I came from mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Yeah. This statement, it almost feels like a statement of acceptance, but really, in truth, it seems to be a statement where he has failed to accept and realize that this loss has really happened. He still is trying to process the situation, and he's put up this buffer around him to protect him from the situation. I think that we see that a lot in the denial stage.
Yeah, well, I tell you what, just getting that from a point of taking all of those emotional blows. One man simply say, man, it will shake and your equilibrium. It'll get you off, and you're just out of wonder and amazement, and almost at a place, this can't be happening. And it's just a shock kind of a thing. You're in such a what we don't call a discombobulation kind of a thing, and you really. It really throws you off, and you really can't do that. And so sometimes what we do is that we try to put a buffer for the pain and trying to get a little stoppage. We may say some things like Job simply say, well, the Lord give it, the Lord take it away. This is nothing but a mechanism of trying to preserve himself, to try to save something for himself.
Yeah, it's one of those situations where he's trying to ease his pain. Right. Not ready to accept it yet.
That's right.
He almost has this emotional denial more than anything, where he's making these statements that are almost indicating that he not ready to process the emotions. He hasn't felt it yet. The weight hasn't come down on him yet, and so he's he's trying to make these statements or make these comments that are going to protect him from truly experiencing that pain.
Right, right. That's the point, and we do that all the time. I know we always say, well, that's the way it goes. Ain't nothing we can do. That's our way of dealing with it. And it's not a great way of doing it, but that's the way we do it at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In thinking about denial, and we've discussed this a little bit, but why do you think we typically experience this denial stage? Do you think it's a healthy thing that we experience this? Do we need that time of buffering as we try to process it?
Like you said, the ideal of it is we're trying to manage the pain. We're just trying to get through this thing, and in our own way, we kind of I don't want to say dismiss it, but we try to minimize the pain. It's a mechanism where I'm trying to avoid things. I'm trying to save myself, so to speak. It's not a healthy thing, because when we don't accept what really is, then we can never get to the point to where we really can and should be. So I don't think it's a good thing to deny it, but it's an ideal for them at the time, for self-preservation at the moment. It's a defense mechanism, trying to work through some things the best way that this person can. With Job, man, there's a lot of things. Wait a minute, you say I've lost my livelihood. You tell me my children gone now? Yes, and so it was just one after the other. So you got to find some kind of sense to it, and in order to be able to make it. And so he comes up with this philosophy of I came in the world without it, and I'm going to leave without it. But that's his way of trying to make his way through it. It's not sensible. It's not healthy. It's not something that's going to really get him through it. But that's all he had at the moment.
Sometimes I think we convince ourselves that the longer we can put off our pain,
yes,
the easier it's going to be to deal with it. But more often than not, we find that's not the case.
Yeah.
But instead, the longer we put it off, the harder it hits us when it finally hits us.
Yes.
And so, while denial is not healthy, I think it's a natural response when we face pain to try to push it off and try to avoid the pain of the moment. But it's a healthy thing when we realize this has happened,
yes,
and we were able to start moving forward through it. So while denial may not be a necessarily healthy stage, but it's a stage that more often than not we experience, again, for almost self-preservation.
That's what it is.
So here we've seen this first stage of grief, this idea of denial. The second stage that Kubler-Ross suggests is the stage of anger.
Okay.
In this stage, maybe people ask the question of why is this happening? They become angry because of the situation that's taking place, and angry because of their circumstances, and questioning why would these things be happening in my life.
Right.
These individuals going through the anger stage, they realize that a loss has occurred, but they may become angry at themselves or others, and they try to argue that the situation isn't unfair, and sometimes that ends up being where we place blame on others, or maybe even on ourselves for the situation.
Yeah.
Job, as he was experiencing his moments of anger,
right,
we see him really struggle with it. And at the end of chapter 2 of the book of Job, we see where he's experiences great grief, and these three friends come and sit with him. We'll talk a little bit more about them later, but they're sitting with him, and for 7 days and 7 nights they don't say a word, but they're just sitting there, and they're Job is sitting in his grief and in his pain, and finally, as we get into chapter 3, his emotions overwhelm him to the point where he lets out his anger. And all of chapter 3 focuses on this idea that he curses the day that he was born. He wishes he was never born. Man, if I was never born, I never would be experiencing this pain. If I was never born, I wouldn't be going through this. I wouldn't experience this loss. But even later in the book of Job, we see where he blames God. and he begins questioning God.
Yeah.
And why would God allow these things to happen in my life? So he's misplacing his anger here and pushing it on himself and pushing it on his mother. Why was I born? And pushing this anger on God. So when we think about this anger stage, why can it be so dangerous for us when we become overwhelmed by this anger stage of grief?
The idea of that would be because if I'm angry, and if I don't deal with it in a logical, sensible way, we do begin to blame people, and we're frustrated. And I could understand him going to that. I'm not saying that it's good, but that's a human thing to do. And you look at a parent. No parent wants to see their children pass before them. No one wants to do that. But the idea of this anger, then getting off into the blame, then we will not deal with the issue as they really are. We begin to put all our energies, direct all of our energies to that something with which we can never control in the first place. And if we blame other people, even though that may give us a little moment of release, you know what I'm saying? But at the end of the day, it comes back to reality. Here's what it is. We got to look at it. Why I'm angry? Because something that I love, someone whom I cherish, has been taken away. Yes, I'm angry. I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's right. I'm a good man. I live a good life. I always try to uphold that which is right. I don't live in a bad way. And here's what I get for this. I mean, that's the way to do. Everybody just add up the chips and say, I don't. Everybody else not doing right. They don't have these problems, but I got them.
You know, anger isn't. It's not unhealthy to experience anger.
No.
You know, we experience when we lose someone we love. We're going to be angry. We want them. We want them in our lives. We don't want to live without them. And so anger is a natural feeling.
Natural one.
But when anger isn't dealt with properly, then it can lead to a few things. It can lead to resentment for ourselves and for others.
Yes.
Right? We talked about placing blame on other people. If we blame other people for a loss, then we may get to the point where we sever other relationships because of this loss.
That's it.
And if we blame ourselves and resent ourselves, then we're going to lower the value we place on ourselves, which, you know, and some people could easily lead to self-harm.
Yes.
You know, you think about Job here, you know, resenting the day that he was born. I wish I was never born. And there's a real problem that can arise when we're experiencing grief and we have those kinds of thoughts.
Yeah, and it is bad. I've had several clients. Generally, I always ask questions all the time, and I would just ask them, "How are you feeling about that? Or how are you doing with this? Are you feeling sad?" Or if they say something hinting towards that way, that might give me some cause to think and to watch. If it said, I wish I'd never been born, such a statement that Job made, then I tell you what, I'm going to be asking questions. How you feel about that? You wish you had never been born. Do you feel like going on living? And because I'm trying to see if there's any kind of suicidal ideation or any type thing like that. Because when some people wish they'd never been born, then who knows, maybe off by themselves they say, well, maybe I just end it then. That could happen. So I have some problem with that when people start making statements like that.
Yeah. Well, again, while the anger stage can be healthy, it's important to work through those emotions.
Yeah.
We have to be careful about how we deal with it, and we can't allow our anger to take things too far. Otherwise, it can lead to those serious issues. So, so here we've seen this two stages now here of grief. But that brings us to the third stage. And the third stage of grief that's suggested by Kubler-Ross is the stage of bargaining. And this is kind of an interesting stage. Maybe when we enter this stage, we have the thought that I'll do anything to change this. I'll do whatever it takes to change my situation right now. And all this is doing, all this bargaining is doing, is helping to delay the loss.
Yeah.
We want to change or delay what's happening here, so we begin bargaining.
Okay.
Let's think about it from Job's perspective for a minute. Job, as he enters this bargaining stage, we see where he begins pleading with God. Yeah. He's pleading with God to help his situation change. As we get over into Job chapter 10, we see some of this bargaining. And in this pleading, he says in verse 2, he says, "Show me why you contend with me." Here he's trying to make sense of his situation. I want things to be different. I don't want to experience this pain. And here he's blaming God. God, this has happened. Clearly, you're allowing this to happen. And so he's blaming God, and he's bargaining with God to figure out, what can we do to change the situation? Why are you mad? Why'd you allow this to happen? What can I do? How can I change in the future to avoid these feelings moving forward? I think Job maybe experienced this because both his wife and his friends told him that the reason he's experienced this pain and the reason he lost all these things because God is punishing him. Yeah. So Job here is working through these emotions, and he's thinking back over his life, and he's realizing he's an upright man, he's a righteous man, he's done nothing wrong, but yet he's facing this. So he goes and pleads to God, bargaining with God. God, tell me why you contend with me. How can we fix this situation?
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of strange, though. We get that this tip-top biography of Job at the beginning of the book, and then all of a sudden the friends come, and some type of way, all that he's been doing, somehow his friends were convincing enough to get him to believe that maybe something I just done wrong, messed up. But we got his biography there saying he's a good man. He feared the Lord, and he eschewed evil. But somehow these friends of his, and I think later on he said, some fair physicians you all are. Yeah. But anyway, they questioned him, they pounded enough for him to begin to question himself, and doing so he began to question God as well. So that's a tough one, but we're trying to find out some reasons why this is happening. I just want to know, and how far will this go, and how much will I endure? I just want to know what's going to go on, what's going to happen to me now. So I'm trying to make it. So we try to bargain some type of way. I just want to know what's happening, but in the meantime, I would like to see how far I can move forward and how long I can last.
So through Job's bargaining here, he was trying to find a solution that could help ease his pain. Yes. God, let's work something out here. What can we do that's going to be mutually beneficial to help me not feel this pain and feel this suffering anymore? What can I do to help this situation? What can you do? 'Cause let's meet in the middle. Let's do something. Why do we have this tension between us? Bargaining, I think, is something that we see in our lives too when we're dealing with grief, and a lot of times maybe the bargaining we experience is similar to Job, or maybe we try to bargain with God, especially those of us with religious backgrounds. Maybe we find ourselves bargaining with God. What does that maybe look like in the life of an individual when they're bargaining in the stage of grief?
Well, the idea of it is it all depends on what is at the foundation of the grief. Let's just say a person for divorce or things like that, or job or whatever like that. They will offer up some alternative things that they could do that perhaps that would lessen the oncoming relationship pain or the employment pain. Will offer some type of solution to where I can maintain this and avoid the pain of it. So it all depends on exactly what area you're talking about, what it will look like. So in Job's case, here's the idea. Well, there's children gone, livestock gone. So the only thing he could think about now was, see, the only bargain he has to left is himself. It's the only thing he has left. What that would look like. I get away from these boys. I'll be able to regain my my physical health and my emotional health, and I can really understand my spiritual connection. So it looks differently from the circumstances and the problems that people are addressing. So with Job, he's trying to get rid of this pain so he can be able to at least deal with God and get some kind of semblance of stability and enjoyment. That's about it with him. I just want to know, what can I do to get away from this right now? Yeah.
Sometimes in our life maybe we do very similar things. Where, God, if you just give me a little more time with this person, or
that's it.
Or God, if you would just extend their life for a few more days, or,
right?
Maybe we begin bargaining with God, hoping that we can have a little bit more with the person we love, and sometimes we may even go so far as to say, if you allow this to happen, I'll make these grand changes in my life.
Oh yeah.
And sometimes maybe those are far-fetched things, but at that point, in this stage of grief, we're willing to do whatever it takes.
Right, whatever it takes.
If it takes me making these grand changes for this grief to change, I'll do it.
That's it.
And again, sometimes that bargaining is based on reality, and sometimes it's not. But in that moment, all we care about is trying to ease that pain.
Ease that pain, as you said before. That's what happens. I see people about to separate, and I'll do whatever you want me to do. What do you want me to do? How can I make this right? I just don't want this. What I need to. We do that all the time. We bargain when we see pain heading our way. That's just a natural human trait. Try to avoid all the pain that we can, and try to enjoy all the pleasure that we can. That's the way it is for as life is concerned. But grief can come in different ways, and hopefully that, like Job, all of us eventually work through it. Hopefully.
So here we've seen this third stage of grief, the stage of bargaining, and that brings us to the fourth stage that's suggested by Kubler-Ross. And the fourth stage of grief is depression.
Yes.
Depression is maybe the most difficult stage as we're going through it.
Yes.
Because this depression stage oftentimes leads to feelings of despair, and we struggle knowing where to turn. Maybe when we're going through this stage, we ask ourselves the question of what's the point of going on with life? Maybe we struggle with seeing the meaning of life moving forward. And oftentimes the stage is characterized by individuals who come to realize that a loss is incurred, but they begin to isolate themselves and spend time in this great grief. And a lot of times it seems as though the depression stage is a precursor to the acceptance stage, because we've trying to work with how to cope with the grief that we're dealing with. So in the life of Job, we see him experience this depressive state, maybe in the greatest sense early on in his story. We talked about as we started how people don't experience these stages all in the same order, in the set order. But we see Job experience his depression at the end of chapter 2. You see here at the end of chapter 2, he's just experienced all this great loss: his property, his family, his own health. And then in verses 11 through 13 of Job chapter 2, this is where we are introduced to his friends, which we mentioned a little bit ago: Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And these friends, they come and they want to be there to comfort their friend Job, but they look at him and they see at the end of verse 13 that his grief was great, and he was hurting and he was struggling, and he was overwhelmed by his grief. And so what they chose to do was to just sit there and be with him, and we're told they sat there for 7 days and 7 nights,
7 days and 7 nights.
and just were there in the presence of their friend. See, at this point, Job wanted to be isolated. He wasn't ready to talk about his emotions. He wasn't ready to hear from others about his emotions.
Gotcha.
And that's okay. That was what he needed in that moment.
Right.
But we see him here just kind of dealing with these things internally and processing his pain. See, depression is a really mentally and emotionally and physically draining event.
Yeah.
But it's so important because it helps us find meaning in life after our loss.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's kind of simple. I always, the two adage, they always said, you never miss what you never had. And you never really understand a frown until you smile. So the point of it is that that depression is a natural thing. And how long that lasts, situational depression, you can expect that. That is a natural path to take. It only becomes problematic when it keeps us from moving forward, when it keeps us from functioning, when it keeps us from going about our daily task. Then we can say that depression, with them not working through it properly, has come to a negative way rather than a positive way. I expect someone to be depressed. I mean, when you've been excited, you're riding this cloud of joy with the one you love or with what you were doing, with what you were engaged in, then it's removed, then you also think, if I'm high, then I'm looking to be low. That's just a natural thing, and as you said, this depression, that is the beginning of a person healing. And I hope that all of us who've lost someone can go through that natural process.
You know, depression seems to be something that you may never completely overcome, depending on the loss you faced. You know, there are always going to be times where we're going to have those feelings of depression. Maybe it's the anniversary of the loss of someone, or maybe we see a picture that reminds us of the individual, and we have those feelings, and it's natural to have those feelings even long extended after we've experienced that loss. But the challenge is, how do we work through our emotions to the point that we don't constantly feel that depression anymore? And that's a really difficult thing to do, and many people struggle with that for a long period of time. So as we think about overcoming and working through this stage of depression, how is it that individuals can overcome their depression and work through that and begin to move forward in life?
I think the best thing to do is for a person to accept it for what it really is. This is a loss. This is an unrecuperative loss. As soon as I begin to accept that as reality and of a certain finality to that, it is only then that I'm going to be able to look at it for what it is and move forward. That's a part of it, and that's part of the process. And I do think that when I accept that loss, working through it, and as you just said, we'll constantly be reminded of it. Events, times, seasons, things like that. We'll remember those times, and we'll have those momentary depressive kind of a situation. But we have to accept reality, then start looking at who I am now. Understand. You look at the picture, you see him or her, you see them around you, then you just acknowledge the fact and say, hey, I was a father. I was a wealthy farmer. I was a really happy husband. All of that is gone now. I can't get that back. Only thing I need to do now is try to create a new state of happiness, a new state of working through things. Until I do that, I'm not going to go through this process. I'm not going to make it far from here. Then it ceases to be that important situational depressive state. Then it becomes a long term continual state of depression where I can't function nor enjoy life. Then that's the problem. But I need to accept who I am, my different roles in life, and how I play it out to the fullest. Until I get that point, I'm going to be someone very miserable for a long time.
Yeah, until we figure out how to adjust to our new reality,
yes,
we'll continue to be in that state of depression. And as you mentioned, I think this is both an internal issue and it's an external adjustments that need to be made. Right, we're not going to be the same person we were after we experience a loss.
That's right.
We're just not. It's going to change us.
Right.
And so we need to decide, figure out this internally. Who are we now?
Right.
And decide how do we move forward with this new identity.
Right.
For who we are. But there are external factors too, right? We have to make these adjustments.
Right.
In an external way. You know, what new roles do I have to play? Right. Maybe we had a spouse that we had been with for years and years and years, and there were certain roles that we did and certain roles they performed, and now with them not there, maybe there are new roles we have to learn, or new traits or skills we need to learn, or we need to figure out what resources do we have to deal with these these things that I can't deal with on my own. And
That's right.
So there are adjustments that we have to make, and until we've worked through and analyzed and considered those adjustments in life, we may continue to feel that depression because we're trying to be who we were before the loss.
Oh yeah, I tell you, if you got some activity you participated in together as a couple, thing like that, then you're no longer able to do that. I tell you, that could be a tough, difficult time, because so much of your gratification, so much of your satisfaction in life came from your doing that with that person, with your loved one, or with this other person of importance, and that's no longer there. So now you're left, and you're there by yourself, and I don't think that a lot of people, even though we try to be there for them, I don't think that, just from conversations we have, that people really understand the concept of loneliness, the concept of emptiness, and that grief. As they think about it, they may see something and say, we used to do that. It's tough. We used to go there. Tough. I'm used to her sitting by me. I'm used to him standing with me. All of those things is totally different. That grief goes on for a while, and it is a tough, tough road to travel.
It's from my perspective, this depressive stage of grief is maybe the most challenging to work through and most challenging to overcome. But when we're able to work through that depressive stage, it leads us to this fifth stage of grief, which is acceptance.
Yes.
And we'll never reach the acceptance stage of grief until we work through our depression in the grieving process. So as we think about the acceptance stage, here's where maybe finally we can say to ourselves, it's going to be okay.
Okay.
Life's going to be okay. This loss hurts. I'm struggling from it. There's always going to be a void. There's always going to be a hole in my life, but I'm going to be okay, and I can find a way to move forward even through this loss.
Right.
Job, it took him a while to get to that point of acceptance.
It's true.
But ultimately he got there. He's had a big chunk of the book here of Job is this back and forth debate that Job is having between him and his friends. And all the while Job is trying to defend himself, and we see where ultimately he ends up turning and blaming God for a lot of this, and so do his friends. And so at the end of the book of Job here, in chapters 38 through 41, God speaks up for himself.
Speaks up.
And he reveals himself to Job in the form of this whirlwind, and defends his character, defends who he is to Job. And Job was kind of put in his place at this moment, and he realizes that in the final chapter of the book of Job, in Job chapter 42, that he no longer could blame God. God wasn't to blame.
True.
And by doing so, he was able to move forward with his life and accept the reality of what was taking place. He repented to God and worked through those emotions, and worked through the logic of the situation and accepted the reality of the loss.
There you go. There you go.
So it's important, though, that as we think about the acceptance stage, that we understand that acceptance doesn't mean we forget our loss, but instead we find ways to move forward without our loss.
Right. Right. That's the whole point when it comes down to acceptance. Like you said, it doesn't mean that that I forget about them. I hope and trust that you don't. But you use and rely on that past relationship to be able to move forward. The strengths that you got from being with this person, the outlooks and all the things that help you doing that. You could use all of those times, those instances, to kind of help or support your life at this particular time. So I'm just kind of bolster you a little bit. I accept it. Doesn't mean I'll forget. And I tell you what, when you're in a relationship with people and you love one another, you develop your own traditions and rituals and things like that. Those things never leave you. Hopefully that you will utilize those things and build on it, enjoy it, realizing from whom and for what relationship you were able to do those things as you buttress your life after your loss.
Here's the good news, though. Even though in the moment maybe it doesn't feel like it,
right?
There is life after loss.
Oh yeah.
Sometimes we're suffering with loss and we're going through it. And we're in the middle of those storms of life. Sometimes it feels like there's no life after loss, but the reality is there is. And we see this in the life of Job. You know, Job here for 41 chapters, he is struggling with his grief, and he's working through it and trying to overcome it. But as we get to the end of this book in chapter 42, we see where God continued to bless Job even after his loss.
Oh yeah.
Where God blessed him. Job ended up with twice as much as what he had before. He got livestock again. He had family again. He had children again. He had all this land again. And at the very end of Job chapter 42 and verse 16, it said, after this, Job lived 140 years and saw his children and grandchildren for 4 generations. So Job died old and full of days.
Yes.
See, in that moment, Job didn't see that there was life after his loss.
Okay.
I wish I was never born. But he realized after he was able to work through the stages of grief and process his grief, that there were still people in his life that he could bless, and there were people in his life that could bless him.
Right.
So it's important that we understand as we work through the acceptance stage of grief that there is life after loss.
Yes. Yeah, there is life after loss, and I did love it. This loss is not a final. Not a final statement, as you said. I deal with my loss, but I'm also open for some upcoming gains. I do believe that if I trust in the Lord and I use those memories that I've had before to buttress me and keep me alive for the moment, and that I have something good awaiting me, I have to be able to, in spite of my pain, enjoy all the blessings that are before me at the moment. If I'm really engrossed, really overtaken by my loss, I don't get to enjoy the now that God has placed before me. Enjoy the people who are around you. Love them. You'll never get over missing your loved one, but enjoy the ones who are around you. That is a blessing in and of itself.
Mm-hmm. You know, we know that there are individuals who are watching this that are experiencing grief and loss in a serious way, and maybe you've been dealing with it and working through it for a long time, and you're struggling working through the process of it. We want you to know we feel for you, and we love you, and we understand your pain. Grief is something that all of us deal with, and some of us deal with it in different ways and in more difficult ways than others. But we want you to understand that your grief is normal. To feel pain and feel grief and feel depression because of a loss is a normal thing.
Yes.
But it's also something that we should constantly be trying to work through in our lives. There is healthy grief, but there is also unhealthy grief. And if you continue to struggle with grief in your life, we want to encourage you to find someone that you can talk to, whether it's one of us or find a close friend or find someone, a healthcare professional, someone that can help you overcome and work through your grief.
Yeah.
You know, see, we don't have to live the rest of our lives in the shadow of depression through grief. We're never going to forget our loss, but it's going to change who we are.
Yes.
But we don't have to continue to live with that pain and suffer in such a way. And so, if you're struggling with grief, we want to encourage you to find someone or find a solution that can help you work through that grief in a healthy way.
Yes.
We hope that our discussion here today has been helpful to you and beneficial to you in understanding the process of grief. And we hope that you'll join us again next week as we talk about how we can encourage and comfort and help those who may be grieving in our lives.
Amen.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of the Abundant Life Podcast.
Yes.
Hope that you all have a blessed day.
Good.